Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my guest from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hi, Arnie. Yeah, the guests would have included my brother, but he's not here today. I think he's a bit under the weather, maybe.
Yeah, no worries.
It'll just be the two of us, I guess.
Okay, we'll look forward to it, Robert. And I guess the thing to make note is that we, in our discussions, we actually are standing on the shoulders of giants of men who've actually gone before us. And one of those giants is Wallace Klinck. So we wish him well. All right, I'm going to cut across to websites, and let's start having a look at things I think are of interest today. So we'll pick up the news, and most of the noise around the place is in regard to vaccines, school kids missing out on their decent education, things of that nature, and the number of vaccines that are actually achieving in the community. Now, I think this article here in Epoch Times is very, very important, and that is that a left-wing aligned union has decided that it's going to start jeopardising our supply grid, and they're going to have a nationwide strike on August the 27th. So that's coming up in a couple of days, 2 days' time. And the thing is that this will affect our supply chains. Now, remember I said to you a few weeks back about the World Economic Forum was actually mentioning how critical the supply chain or the grids, if they happen to have a cyber attack, and how they could go down and stay down. And this affects, of course, food security. Transport Workers Union, I understand their frustration, cross-border, massive testing, there's a lot going on, but there's a bigger picture here, and them choosing to strike is not helping that bigger picture. They would do well to actually ensure the supply chain stayed open. They would do well to actually ensure the food security, fuel, and all that sort of stuff, the integrity, the security of the nation was protected. That is their calling. And to do this at this time, I think is quite a dangerous thing to do. Fauci, get vaccinated, is all these promises, but no real fruition in that. Interesting article. We've got an Australian politician, Malcolm Roberts, who's making a bit of noise about Alphabet being the parent company to Google and YouTube. Now, Alphabet, of course, is run by, if you follow it up the food chain and you go to a website called brothernathaniel.com, you'll find that Alphabet is actually run by CIA and Mossad. And, of course, Google the same, and that type of thing. So you recognise that these are part of security intelligence, national security intelligence, and they're not, as we may think, as Joe Nova is actually saying here, or Senator Malcolm Roberts is presenting. We're not actually thinking that this is actually a security organisation more than a company. So, of course, he's pointing the bone at it, saying that the Alphabet is actually tied in with vaccines. Well, that's true, but so are a lot of other things. And I wanted to bring up the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. It's one of 3, I believe, institutes of this nature around the world. It has 1,200 on the website. It says 1,200 talented researchers, mostly predominated at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, Victoria. Bear in mind that Murdoch Children's Research Institute was actually established 1986 by a $5 million donation from the Murdoch family. There was a patriarch, Dame Elizabeth Murdoch, a matriarch, that's the right word. She was part of that. She was made the patron of that institute. And of course, the Murdoch Children's Research Institute is part of the, if you like, tied in with the family that totally dominates Australian media. And so when you look at the likes of the work of Judy Weilerman, let's pick it up here, PDF library under W. Weilerman, W-H-Y, W-I, there it is. Critical analysis of the Australian government's rationale for its vaccination policy. This was her PhD. and she went out after what was going on with the Australian government's vaccination policy, and she pointed directly back at the Institute, the Murdoch Institute, as having a very significant influence over government policy. So when you start talking about the likes of Alphabet dominating Google and YouTube, and recognising that the military industrial complex also ties in with the intelligence industry, then you recognise that, hang on, this is an absolutely huge can of worms. Absolutely huge can of worms. And this is a reason why it's very difficult to decipher truth from fiction or biased reporting. Now, Murdoch family empire, they are responsible for Fox News. Fox News presents itself as conservative, and Malcolm Roberts presents himself as conservative. But if you actually look more deeply, you'll see that there's actually vested interest. There's actually vested interest in the promotion of certain policies. And that to me is the idea, that is the function, that is the role, the true role of the media, is actually to uncover those vested interests and say, well, there might be an institute, there might be a charitable organisation, there might be an established, if you like, now what do they call it? I can't remember the name, it'll come to me later. But the purpose behind it is that they are doing benevolent acts, when in actual fact there is a vested interest. If you happen to own a company that produces vaccine, and you have an institute that promotes vaccine as a charitable front for it, then it's not actually that charitable at all. It's actually a marketing ploy in order to promote your business, if that is the purpose behind it. And that to me is something that I think is very foundations. That's right, these charitable foundations. That's something that you've really got to consider, that there may be vested interests and there may actually be biased reporting, simply by not reporting, simply by censorship. So it's really, really important to take these things into account. Now, last week's On Target, I brought up that who actually profits by vaccines? Who profits by the masks? Who profits by the vaccine passport, the lockdown? Who profits? And you'll see each time that question is raised, you'll see that these mega corporations are at the forefront of these profiting. You look at the likes of what Amazon is doing to marketing, its lion's share. That bloke in charge of it is turning himself into a trillionaire. And the small businessman, the small delivery, the small hardware, the small warehouse, the small shop, they're folding, and they're folding in their hundreds of thousands. Now, Australia is a reflection, if you like. The statistics aren't necessarily as obvious in Australia, but they certainly are in America. There was a 40% increase in United States. 40% increase in United States of families who earn insufficient to pay income tax. That means they're falling below the poverty line. They're falling to the green stamp level. Then that food vouchers and things like that. That's what's really going on with this lockdown. It's a complete collapse of the middle class. It's a complete collapse of small business. And the Transport Workers Union are not helping. They're not helping. They're actually deliberately being goaded by their organisers into this. They're being goaded into this so that the effect is compounded. They're actually doing the work of the multinational. This is exactly what the multinational wants. They want to inflict so much that they totally control the whole world. That's this narrative. And of course, in and amongst it are our media conglomerates, but also those privately run criminal organisations that I call political parties. Privately run criminal organisations. You can't describe them as anything better than that. They are not representing the electorate. They are not representing the people. They are actually representing other interests. And that is so, so important. Where are we to go? Where are we to go when we think we voted this way last time? We voted red last time. Let's vote blue this time. Let's vote green. Let's vote orange or brown. And yet, each time you do it, the outcome does not change. And the reason why it doesn't change is because these are top-down structures. From their very establishment, it is all about power. It is all about controlling the narrative so that you don't even know which way to turn. And that is a tactic of war. Anyone who's actually taken the time to read, is it Sun Tzu, The Art of War? If you think we're marching, we're sleeping. If you think we're sleeping, we're marching. Every time. By way of, if you like, by way of deceit. Anyway, that's my opening salvo. It's not a pretty picture. It's very difficult where we are, and it's quite difficult to decipher. But that's my take on it. Anyway, I'll give you the floor, Robert Klinck.
Well, we suffer from a lack of education and a lack of sophistication. We don't, generally speaking, understand how revolutionary activity has gone on in the past. It's nothing new. It's been going on for centuries, basically always using the same techniques. And there are people who, as you say, Arnie, strive for power. Their whole purpose in life is to get control over institutions and the population through those institutions. It's their purpose of existence. And they are, in their eyes, winners. And the prize goes to the person who gets ahead of everybody else. This is an ethic that is alien to Christian civilization. Christian civilization was based on the idea that we should be sharing in abundance, and we should be caring towards our fellows, not in the socialist sense. The socialist sense takes everything away from everybody else and then redistributes a portion of it according to the whims of this authoritarian control center. You know, you've mentioned this trucker strike, and when I heard about that in Canada, and it was being presented as a revolt by the Australian people. They're fed up, and they are going to shut down the country until the government changes. That's what I was hearing. I thought, wow. But immediately I thought, this is just an old revolutionary technique. They get their people in there, and they get the message out that they're doing something beneficial for the country, but you shouldn't listen to that. You've got to look at you have to look at the results. And what will the results of this strike be? As you say, Arnie, it could be very harmful to the population in general. It could be very harmful to the existing supply lines and actually destroy them on a long-term basis. So people have to be a little bit more sophisticated in their perceptions and realize that there are people who want to destroy and to make trouble. This COVID thing, for example, there's no end to what is demanded in this COVID propaganda. Nothing is good enough in this COVID propaganda. They tell you you're going to shut down for 15 days and then things will go back to normal. And then they can't go back to normal because that number, which is supposed to be less than 1, is too high. So you have to retain the controls. And then the death rate is spiking, and but that's the strange thing is that they are in the process of promoting this. They're changing all the definitions so that what you would have been speaking of in the past is no longer what you're speaking of today. The definition of pandemic is changed. The definition of mandatory has changed, hasn't it? You know, something that before was not mandatory meant that you didn't suffer a penalty if you didn't participate in it. But now you're being threatened with the penalty of being completely sidelined from the economy and from every social activity. And yet these governments are saying, oh, well, we're a society that doesn't impose mandatory policies on the population. I think maybe they're now conceding that there is a mandatory element to this, but for so long they were saying that. But the definition of mandatory is that you don't have to do it, and you won't be penalized if you don't do it. But gone out the window. So also the definition of safe. These products, these COVID vaccines, they're all being described constantly as safe and effective. Well, the effectiveness seems to be highly in question now because the people who've been vaccinated seem to have no particular immunity to the disease or the condition that they were supposed to be being protected from. The latest evidence of all that in Israel and Iceland, Massachusetts, and Gibraltar is that people who have been vaccinated have no special protection against getting COVID. The only argument that's still being made, they're not going to give up on that one, it seems, is that they are supposed to be less seriously affected. But the message that's been coming from doctors in Israel is that the double vaccinated people are in hospital and many of them are grievously ill. So I don't know what we're supposed to make of this. It's just an unending string of contradictions and inconsistencies, and how you see clearly in it is very, very difficult. And there's no doubt that this is an intentional situation. This has been deliberately created so that people are arguing back and forth without understanding what is really going on. This is part of a revolutionary strategy. And if you look at, for example, the communist movement going back to the Soviet Union in the early days, all this is old hat and going on forever. They are very assiduous and they are very clever psychologists, and they play the population like puppets in that way. Another thing you mentioned there, Arnie, was the involvement of maybe charities or anyway, beneficial organizations. And you look at what they're up to, it's supposed to be very philanthropic. But when you dig more deeply into it, you find out that it's very likely just a profit-making venture. And they're playing both sides of an operation in order to control a commercial enterprise. And it's very strange. You know, in the past, at least the media focused on one thing. And I think, you know, if you go back 30, 40 years, they were always talking about conflict of interest. Well, that seems to be a concept that has disappeared from our culture, because conflicts of interest are constantly being identified, but they have no practical consequences. If they're shown to exist, nothing happens. In the past, there would be some sort of governmental intervention or judicial process involved, but that all seemed to have gone by the board. So we're living in times when we don't have effective protections anymore against all sorts of evils in society. And definitely we need to do some serious thinking about this and to invigorate our institutions, sound principles, so that we get protection from these destructive tendencies.
Thank you so much for that, Robert. I note that we've got Wally on board. Welcome, Wally Klinck.
Sorry, Arnie, late again. I couldn't find that link.
No worries.
So anyway, here we are.
Pleased to have you. Pleased to have you, Wally. Yep.
Well, thanks. Glad to be here. No, I agree with Bob. There's nothing there's nothing indefinite about this. It's very deliberate. It's a psychological technique to confuse people, to confuse their cognitive functioning, and to make them ineffectual, actually, in defending themselves against these seemingly endless definitions and intense. It's confusion. When the mind is confused, the mind does not think rationally. And they're trying to totally confuse the public's mind. And that's what it's basically all about. They want compliance, and they want compliance through confusion.
No worries. Thank you so much for that, Wally, and lovely to see you on board. Thank you for coming. I get quite concerned when I'm looking at these, if you like, the relationship between public and private institutions reflected in organisations such as the World Economic Forum. What I noted the other day was that Klaus Schwab, he's actually the director. He's the director of the World Economic Forum. I see that as a branch of the United Nations, but he's actually, it's a private institution that he controls, and he has the authority under that constitution to actually appoint the next director. Excuse me? He has the authority. Now, that is absolutely profound when you start thinking along those lines, that someone has the authority to actually appoint the next director, and that organisational structure is such that it dominates the thinking of entire nations. In fact, in this case, what we're looking at is we're looking at thinking of the whole world. That's what we're looking at. Now, I want to cut across to a website, and I want to actually show you something that I just uncovered, and it was only just yesterday. I mentioned Judy Weilerman, and I really appreciate her work, and she has certainly opened up so much thinking to me about this vested interests, and I really appreciate her scholarship. It is brilliant, and I think that you should make it your business to have a look at her work. But today, I want to actually direct our attention to two other people. One is Ted Mack. Ted Mack was a member of the House of Representatives. I should actually have that up there. Beyond Representative Government and the Henry Parkes Oration. Now, Ted Mack, when he was Mayor of North Sydney, Ted Mack had had enough sense and enough faith in the people of his council area to initiate referenda, citizens-initiated referenda and recall. He actually brought it into being in that North Sydney Council. And over the course of his mayoralship, they had multiple referendas, and they also equally had open government. Open government. Now, what is open government? Open government is where you take notes, and if you pass resolutions, those are recorded on those notes. And unless it's a position of legal opinion, where you're seeking legal opinion in regard to a particular process or policy, every single thing was documented, and those documents were available for public scrutiny. Now, in regard to, say, something like we're looking at COVID, now our National Cabinet may or may not take notes, may or may not make resolution. But none of that is recorded, and none of it is available for public scrutiny. And it has taken a High Court decision to actually start to jar open those secret meetings that go on. And the thing is, it's within the secret meetings that actually starts to show vested interest. Now, in regard to, say, Canberra has registered lobbyists who outnumber the politicians by a magnitude. Now, those lobbyists are continuously approaching politicians in order to pursue benefit for their organisations, for their industries. Now, this is unprecedented. I believe that high courts have already shown that nothing should interfere with the representative and the people in their electorate. Nothing should interfere with that. And yet here we have registered lobbyists who are able to attract the attention of our representatives perhaps multiple times every day, and yet you as an individual in your electorate can't even get to see your politician because they're so busy. Now I'm experiencing that. I've been trying for 2 years to see almost 2 years. In January it will be 2 years. It's almost September. In January it'll be 2 years to see my representative, and I have to make another approach. Now, lockdown has forced some of those issues to come to a head where it was unavailable or unable to actually approach a politician, but I believe the politician doesn't want to speak to me. I believe that the politician is so, what would you call it, frustrated by what is going on, that they don't know which way to turn. And because they're tied in with a criminal organisation, because they're tied in with it, I call it a criminal organisation, because it's not reflecting the will of the electorate. It's not reflecting the constituency. It's not actually canvassing the people in order to gain a position and then making that position known. I don't believe anything has come from my politician in these last 2 years. Nothing. Everything comes from the Premier. The Premier and if you like, a little junta of public servants that surround him, advisors that surround him. Nothing is coming from my politician. I don't hear any noise at all coming from our Parliament. Now that, to me, shows criminal intent. It shows criminal intent because the vested interests have access to my politician, but I don't. You've really got to look at this whole thing. In Canberra, the lobbyists, they get access to the politician, but you don't. And does the politician actually canvass? Do they actually canvass you? Your opinion, your electorate's opinion, how you're feeling about the lockdowns. The Transport Workers Union, are they fighting for Australia? I don't think they are. I think they're actually misguided. I think they're misguided. What the media may be reporting in Canada certainly isn't the case in Australia. It's not the same message. And unfortunately, I haven't had access to the actual union meetings that go on and the decisions made. Really, really important to get to the core of the truth of these things and whether the union organisers themselves have a vested interest. A vested interest in the sense that they are politically aligned to a revolutionary policy. That's what I mean, a vested interest. Would they actually be doing the work of the devil by not pursuing what's best for the people, best for the nation? Because right now, our supply lines, you look at our energy problems, you look at our fuel problems, we are so exposed. And that's going to bring me back. I'm going to bring it up now. I'm going to hold the floor for a bit because this is really, really important where we're going. Now, I was fortunate to have met this bloke called Graham Campbell in the 90s. He founded the Australia First Party in Australia. And if you like, Pauline Hanson and the One Nation was a Murdoch response. In my view, a Murdoch response to what Graham Campbell was doing. Now, in these papers, these are all position papers, essentially about what Graham Campbell wrote with his advisor, I think it's John Pasquarelli, I think it was, and his advisor helped him compile these papers. And they're really, really important to recognise that in industry, if you've got, say, like primary industry, you've got an iron ore mine, and you've got a bauxite mine, and you decide that you're going to make steel and you're going to make aluminium, and you need infrastructure for that. You need roads, you need power, all that sort of stuff. You need trucks, you need a smelter, all those sorts of things that you need in order to do it. And of course, when Australia hands over its primary industry to other nations, then all these other things are actually turned off. Power generation is turned off. Road maintenance, trucks, railway lines are shut down, things like that. Now, Graham Campbell, he was very aware of it. He was in the largest, I believe it was the largest electorate in the world, and that was Kalgoorlie, at 2.5 million square kilometres. That was his electorate. I'll say it again, 2.5 million square kilometres. He knew the distance of tyranny. He knew the tyranny of heat, deserts, and he himself was a miner, so he knew it. And when he talks about industry, when he talks about a national industrial policy, a national industry policy, he's speaking from first-hand experience where he actually saw it in the Pilbara. He saw it in Kalgoorlie, gold and copper and things like that. He saw these things first-hand of what you actually needed to maintain security for a nation. And that's why his papers are so important. They are actually, in my view, so profound. They're almost a, if you like, considered national security, a national security policy of industry. Because if you can't produce your own steel, to produce your own cars, to produce your own ships, to produce your own trucks, then you can't defend yourself. And that to me is very, very important. Now we're down to almost our last smelter, steel smelter in Australia. This is where we have been emasculated. And in his papers, you will see that the deconstruction of Australian industry was done under Labor. The deconstruction of Australian industry was done under Labor. Liberals did it as well, but the dominant part was Labor. And in the like of Hawke and Keating era, you'll find that the false nationalism argument, which to deconstruct Australia's links, direct links with the, if you like, the British Commonwealth, to deconstruct those was to bring us into the orbit of the United Nations. These are really, really important papers. Really, really important. And if you want to understand history and you want to understand the subterfuge that's going on of vested interests and political policy, and recognising that under Labor, Bob Hawke was an agent acting for the benefit of a foreign power. That's known. The WikiLeaks did that. There's several newspapers have released that since, I think, the 90s, I think. At least 2003 anyway. So we had prime ministers who were in the pocket of other nations or other security organisations. And that's very, very important. Very, very important to recognise. So when you consider who you're going to vote for, and you want to do a red or a green or a yellow or a pink, that's up to you. But the thing is that those have got profound ramifications for Australia's security, our integrity, and our future. And I think that is really, really important that we consider it. Now, Graham Campbell's papers are there for you to look at. They've been on the web on other websites, but I've only personally uncovered them from those websites was yesterday, day before, and I am really pleased to have them. So important. Vested interests, foundations, vested interests, policy, vested interest, political parties, vested interest. You've really, really got to do your homework and have a look at this, because it's not a pretty picture. And to me, it's no different. I mentioned in the On Target, I mentioned the thing about the opium wars and how they used opium to emasculate the people, to weaken their resolve, to break them spiritually. And that's what's going on in Australia, going on in Canada, going on right throughout the Western world. Anyway, your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, definitely, Arnie, there is an attempt to make the population ineffectual. Even if they could formulate their desires, they don't have the means whereby to bring pressure to bear to have them fulfilled. And this is not an accident. It's people who have acquired power, want to retain that power, want to make sure that nobody else displaces them from their positions of privilege. And that's why they are not encouraging the development of a mature, and responsible population. You mentioned how in Australia there are organizations that are not keeping proper records of their deliberations. Well, I understand this is what is known as Chatham House rules. And these are rules whereby these high level politicians can get together and they don't need to keep any records of their discussions. I guess they just come to agreements and are smart enough to keep them in their heads. But it's clearly a method whereby they can prevent the population from discovering what the highest level of policy is. So Chatham House rules is a phrase that people should be aware of, and they should be wary of it as well, because it's a way of keeping information from you. On Klaus Schwab choosing his successor, this is dynastic, isn't it? This is the creation of a system that will be impervious to popular influence. And this is what they want to do in all spheres. It reminds me of what a man named Walter Rathenau. He was a big German industrialist and banker. A very talented man, a brilliant pianist, everything under the sun. Anyway, he was assassinated, I think, around 1923. It's an old assassination. But he made a statement that is reminiscent of what Klaus Schwab has said about choosing his successor to run the World Economic Forum. Because Walter Rathenau said 300 people rule the continent of Europe, and they select their successors from their entourage. So what Klaus Schwab is talking about is hardly anything new. This has been going on behind the scenes probably for centuries, probably preceding Walter Rathenau for a long time. But it is a method of preserving power for people who are exercising it behind a veil, and ensuring that the population don't really understand what's going on. We are presented with a kind of charade, which is the political game. And we're told that we have options and that we can influence policy. But policy is flowing from these people, the 300 or whatever it is, who actually make the decisions that determine what is going to be going on in national and increasingly, in fact, almost entirely now, international politics. They're not people we elect. They're not even people whose identity we know. Who had heard anything about Klaus Schwab last year? I think he was a completely unknown personality. And suddenly he appears on the scene, and he seems to be running half of the policy of the world, this World Economic Forum. Who had heard of that? Well, it's been around for a long time. And I understand, interestingly enough, that Klaus Schwab was once a student of Henry Kissinger. So Henry Kissinger would be one of these people who is involved in selecting his successor. And it looks to me as if Schwab is the selected successor of Henry Kissinger, a man who has been such an influence in American politics now for 50 years at least. 50 years. Goes back through all these presidents, and he still has the ear of the political machinery in the United States. So what we have is that the politics that we're allowed to participate in is fraudulent. It's just a means whereby we can vent and we can burn up our energy, but the result doesn't have any bearing on the policies that are chosen. All you have to do is consider the changes of party through decades now, and you will see a continuity of policy regardless of what party happens to be in power. While they're in opposition, they'll make some noise and they'll raise the hopes of the population that they're going to, because the population is not enthusiastic about a lot of the policies that governments are imposing. So there's always this hope that if they can just turf these scoundrels out, then we'll get some decent people in there. Invariably, the next batch are as bad scoundrels as the ones you've thrown out. So it's politics is just a distraction. It's a dog thrown to the a bone thrown to the dog that is the electorate, and quite a useless thing when it comes to effecting any kind of change. You've got to. I mean, it's a very problematic thing, because how in the world do we know what influences are being brought to bear on the political structure? These are all hidden, mostly hidden. In fact, I will give the so-called leftists credit for being a heck of a lot more aware of these influences than most conservative people. The only problem with the leftists is that they want to centralize power. So their goal is consistent with the goal of the people who are operating to lobby and influence politics behind the scenes. So it's something that we have to study and to make ourselves more aware of, so that we will no longer be defenseless against this influence.
No worries. Thank you for that, Robert. I'm going to give you the floor, Wally, and I'm interested in your thoughts on what's going on. Cheers. Hang on.
Bob has been saying what we are witnessing is not an accident. History is something that is maneuvered, something that is created by conscious minds. And depending on what those minds are dedicating themselves to in the way of policy, determines what kind of a world we have. It's absolutely a manufactured situation. You can see this COVID circumstances. We are simply fed a constant stream of misinformation. And I think that we are also taken off guard by completely meaningless promises of major changes, that there will be a restoration of the old regime. And I don't think that there's anything accidental about it. It's conflicting, and it's enough to ensure that anyone who has a mind but does not have knowledge, does not have understanding, has little or no defense against, because they just don't understand what is going on. And furthermore, those who may have an inkling of understanding are people who either benefit from the system, and a lot of people see themselves being in that position, or they genuinely do not understand what's happening, the policies that are being foisted on them and the rest of the world. Policies of power, the policy of power.
Yeah.
And the benefits that power seeks over the rest of society, and the power that they have engineered. It's not an accident. Not an accident at all.
Yeah. No worries. Thank you for that, Wally. I think between you two, you've covered some very important steps, and I think one of the most important out of that was, Robert, you mentioned how essentially astute the left wing are. They know what's wrong. They know what's wrong with the, if you like, the capitalist machine. They know what's wrong with Fauci and Bill Gates exploiting the circumstances for their own personal gain. They can see the major issues that are on the floor. But their proposal is no better. Their proposal actually plays into the hands of these megalomaniacs. Their proposal is centralising power, giving government more power over people's lives, giving the United Nations more power over people's lives. But let's be realistic about it. Klaus Schwab is tied in. Bill Gates is tied in. Fauci is tied in with the United Nations. They actually have got their finger in the pie of those organisations to directly benefit from it. Now, I know these are overseas people. I'm not actually mentioning the Murdoch regime, but in actual fact, these others certainly do. They directly benefit by these policies. And it's not just in the tune of money, although there's a lot of money to be made. It's actually in the area of power over people. Power over people. Now, I earlier on this year, I presented an image of the regents. I think they were the merchant regents of the Dutch East Indies. It was actually in a museum in Amsterdam. It was a well-painted picture, and they were obviously very opulent men, and they had domination over the whole world, and there was a globe there and atlases and maps and things like that, and they were presenting it. They were making decisions that were actually affecting the entire world, certainly the merchants, the trade, and that sort of thing. And those regents who were depicted there, if you like, the what would you call it, the expression of them came in the fruition of wars against nations for their benefit. The Opium War, I think, is a very, very good example. Twice gunboats went up the rivers in China and opened up on the cities. There was nothing that the cities could do about it. In order for them to control, in order for them to dominate, in order for those cities, which really were city-states, to accept terms of surrender. Now, I read once Vasco da Gama, that Dutch explorer, did he lose, I think, 2/3 of his crew going across to the East Indies for the spices. But again, the same, it was gunboats. It was all these, they're equivalent to today's battleships. Going into a harbour, opening up on the city then has to negotiate peace. What is it that you want? What is it that you want from us? It's no different today. Not guns, vaccines. Same thing. Emasculate the population to the point where they're incapable of defending themselves. That's what I'm seeing. And you see the likes of the news, that's the real news that's actually coming from the adverse effects of mRNA injections. The real news is that the morbidity is greater from the vaccine by a factor of what, 10 or 20 or 100 of seasonal flu, which is what COVID was in the first place. The vaccines are actually causing the damage. The vaccines are causing the spike in the new numbers. That's what's going on, with the effect that the intensive care units in especially New South Wales are building up. The pressure is on, but it's always on for winter seasonal flus, if you like. But in this case, it's different. This case, it's blood clots. This case, it's spike proteins. This case, it's all these direct effects as a consequence of the vaccine. Direct effects. Now, that's the real news. And how much is the media presenting on this? Very little. Why? Because these institutions are part of huge conglomerations. They're part of the, if you like, the merchant class, where their vested interests, their interests are more important than any other interests. And that's what we're seeing. We're certainly seeing it in Australia. We see it more obviously perhaps in United States with Fauci and Bill Gates, but it's still there. This is affecting the whole world. And these merchants are dominating policy across the whole world. That's what's going on. And the role of the media is to expose vested interests. And it's not doing anything of the sort. If I can find it, and I'm as clumsy as an ox, but I can find it. I can find almost direct links there. If I can find it, so can you. And the media is not doing it. They're not actually presenting the case. They're closing their mouth at the critical time. That is censorship. They're censoring the news from us. So we're not getting a clean run, a good run on any of this. And of course, when you've got the criminal organisations, political parties in the pocket of these vested interests, what hope do you have? You wait for the next election? I think it's well past waiting for the next election. I think that the people of Australia have got to seriously start thinking about how we're going to get control and restore democracy back to Australia. Anyway, your thoughts, please, and I'll call for closing comments. Robert Klinck.
Well, some of these organizations, Arnie, are consolidating their positions to such an extent that they're becoming virtually untouchable. For example, this Gavi organization, the Global Alliance of Vaccines and Immunization, which I think is based in Switzerland, very close connections to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, if that foundation is still includes the two names. But they have apparently the status of, in diplomatic terms, the status of a nation. And the people who've analyzed their positions say actually they have privileges beyond the privileges that nations have in the international arena. So these organizations are setting themselves up in such a way that they will be beyond any kind of popular control whatsoever. And it's all being done in legal terms. So if at some point there is a reversal of this flow of power to the center, it's going to be a huge job to disentangle the webs of connections that these organizations have managed to establish. It's really quite astonishing. And I'd say one person in 100,000 has a clue about what is going on in these areas. It's really quite remarkable. Now, another little factoid that I came across the other day illustrates how these family sort of famous people, illustrious people within a family, surface later on. It seems to be consistent with this notion of the organizations selecting their successors. There is an organization in the United States called the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And the director of this organization is the great granddaughter of Leon Trotsky. Now, it could be that a lot of people listening to me don't know who Leon Trotsky was, but he was a brilliant revolutionary who had played a key role in establishing the Soviet Union, had a falling out apparently with Stalin, and ended up being assassinated in Mexico. But isn't it astonishing that this woman has emerged as the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and she's a psychiatrist? Well, apparently her focus is on understanding the effects on young minds of drugs. Well, this is very, it's not going far enough, because the drug culture in the United States is out of control, to the extent that last year, 98,000 young people died of overdoses from fentanyl. So we have the great-granddaughter of Trotsky, who is studying a phenomenon, but not apparently doing anything to overcome the destructive effects of drugging in society. I mean, who is doing this? Who is tolerating this? As you say, Arnie, it's like the opium wars in China, only now it's a war on our own populations. And they keep pretending that they're taking measures to counteract it, but they seem to be so ineffectual. You would swear that they could do more than they're doing, because when the number of deaths goes up by 30% in 1 year, which has happened since this COVID crisis, because people in despair and lacking any other motivation are turning to drug use, then there is a serious problem. And rather than shutting down the economy, they should be providing people with opportunities for constructive participation in society, so they don't get involved in this downward spiral to dissolution and death. Anyway, that's my comment on that. So demoralizing to see the youth of the nation having their lives wasted in this way.
No worries. Thank you so much for that, Robert. I really appreciate it. I'm going to cut back to, in a minute, go back to Graham Campbell, because I think it's so important that we actually look at his position papers and why industry is so important for every nation, because it offers a future. It offers permanency. It offers employment continuity for our young, trades, opportunities, things like that, for them to actually plan a future. And yet all of these things, by the deconstruction of our industry, which was done deliberately by both major political parties in Australia, the deconstruction of our industry, that's the consequence of it, where there is no future for our children, for children's children. Your thoughts, closing comments, please, Wallace Klinck.
Anyone who thinks that this is just some kind of an act of nature is very, very naive. There is conscious intent behind most things that human beings do, and those who plan a world for other people are the most abundantly endowed with conscious intent. They definitely have a superiority complex. They think that they have and are entitled to have a governing role in this world. Whereas in a free society, we would have people being able to pursue their own ends and to do it constructively with minimal interference from outside quarters. But sometimes one would think that people have little confidence in their own abilities. They almost beg for guidance rather than seeking the opportunity to actually spread knowledge, genuine knowledge, in the world. Or they simply are mistaken. I think they're grossly mistaken, because they're trying to literally remake not only the world but the universe according to a different concept of creation. That concept of creation involves the domination of other beings, other people. And that is a very, very frightening thing, especially when we understand the power that they have managed to. The weaknesses of human nature, the lack of understanding, the lack of knowledge, they've been able to impose a policy upon the world. the world. It's very frightening indeed.
Mm.
You have to, I don't think you should give them credit for anything. They have deliberately engineered the situation so power falls into their hands. It does. It falls into their hands because of human ignorance and human failings. And the thing of it is, it could be corrected quite easily if people were permitted to seek knowledge, to possess knowledge, and to utilize that knowledge for constructive purposes, which they're not. It is averted, it is diverted in every possible way. And that the people are subject to this subterfuge is, I think, the explanation for the insanity of the modern world, and I think the only reason to explain it is direct intervention. There is external intervention that is attempting to shape the attitude of the people of the world.
Yeah, yeah. I remember I was just recently reading again Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And in particular, it is the, if you like, the mindset of competition, Darwinism, if you like, survival of the fittest, the mindset. And that is left hemisphere orientated thinking. And it's abstract, and it is actually not real. It's not conducive for building society whatsoever. It's simply about power. So the deconstruction of society is actually an outworking. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing the deconstruction because of this thinking. And in the, if you like, as McGilchrist paints the picture, in the right hemisphere, by looking at the right hemisphere as in the nature of the world, the way it is, the embodiment of it, and people working in community. They're actually working together to achieve mutual benefit rather than individual benefit, but mutual benefit, to complement each other, to actually look at the way the world is, and in harmony with the way the world is to actually put things in place to the way the world works best. Now, I'm going to cut across just as the last time, one more time, to our website, and I'm pretty sure I've got McGilchrist there. There it is. I've got Ian McGilchrist is right here. So this is the PDF library, and McGilchrist is there. Can the Divided Brain tell us anything? Divided Brain, Master Intro and Interview with Ian MacKaye. All of these are public domain documents, and I really, really appreciate the work that he does. I understand that we're in a situation where we actually have to learn how to think again. We have to learn how to think again, because we are the product of at least 50, 60 years of indoctrination. The socialists started in the 1960s, late 1960s, coming into our schools and imposing socialist, if you like, or collectivist or Marxist orientated teaching. And that meant that at least 5 years before then, they were in our universities. And so the product of those universities, of that revolutionary teaching, of this entirely different way of thinking, of not actually placing the world in the way it is, but rather attempting to refashion the world based on rational thinking. And of course that in itself is absurd. You can turn around and say, well, I'm going to rationally think that gravity doesn't work and jump off a cliff. And you can argue all you like, but the consequences are the same. And that's the point of it, that there are natural laws, if you like, canon laws, if you like, about how things work and how people get on and how we work better. And it's in this optimizing of everything that we do. If we consider the natural world, we consider how we actually work best, how it actually outworks best. Mutual love and cooperation. These are quite profound things to actually relearn, but that's where we have to go. We're not going to deconstruct this in the sense of a march, a campaign march in the city or objecting to it. We actually have to go back to first principles and relearn and rethink, and then come back to the point where, okay, where are our children at the moment? Should we actually send our children to be indoctrinated? Should we actually continue the indoctrination to the tertiary level, or should we actually try and place them in the real world in an environment where they can actually observe the natural law and then adhere to it in practical things like building, in farming, in growing, all these sorts of, if you like, natural world considerations. Look at the natural world and how it works. This to me is the opportunity to re-educate. And I think it was St. Paul who said, renewing of your mind. Renewing of your mind. You have to actually change your thinking. And that is the challenge. I believe that's our challenge before us. We've got answers for industry. We've got answers for nationalism, if you like, or nationhood. We've got answers for that. They're all been there before. We can improve on it, but first of all, we've got to relearn them. We can't just come up with the abstract. We've got to come up with that which works best. Thank you so much, Robert and Wallace Klinck, for today. I've really enjoyed it. Not easy where we go. It's difficult, but we're uncovering some things that need to be uncovered and presented to the world so the world can rethink the direction that it's going.
Thank you again, Arnie.
No worries.
Yes, thank you, Arnie. I think what we have to learn really, or maybe learn or just simply reacquire, is a natural love which exists in the universe without human yearning for power over others.
That's right. Love. It is. That's in one word. It is. It's love. This is Arnis Luks at the Crossroads. Thank you so much.